So let's say you're in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant and they essentially refuse to do the work. What does the long-term outcome look like if you stay together? Well, in today's video, I'm going to cover all of this and more so that you have a really clear idea about what you're getting into long-term, assuming the person isn't going to do the work to change. And at the end of this video, we will talk about something really important for you listening. If you're not a dismissive avoidant yourself, but instead in a partnership with a dismissive avoidant, specifically, we're going to dive into what you can do to heal and reassess the situation. So first and foremost, I want to just start by illustrating this story with a client that I had. And I'm terrible at thinking of names on the spot. So from now on, whenever we tell client stories, we're just going to use the name Bob for men, and we'll use the name Rose for women. So in this particular case, I had a client, we'll call him Bob. And specifically from Bob's story, I'm going to share with you 7 core breakthroughs, these sort of aha moments that Bob had in terms of realizing the way he was showing up in a relationship and how this can really illustrate how unhealed dismissive avoidants are likely to show up long term if they never really commit to gaining insight or being willing to do the work. And Bob came to me in his early 60s. And he said, I went through a really profound experience after the loss of my own father. And I realized some of the ways that he showed up as a father to me and how it impacted me throughout my life. And I've decided, even if I'm quite, later on into parenting and the role of being a parent, because my kids are more grown up now, I actually want to dive in and start to look at some of my own patterns and themes and see how I may have impacted my own kids growing up and even my wife. So this backstory of Bob was that he grew up with 2 very dismissive parents. One was dismissive basically because they were going through their own mental health struggles, which was his mother. And his father was just a dismissive avoidant attachment style. He was very DA. He really grew up at a young age on his own, had a tremendous amount of emotional neglect, and never told Bob, I love you. Never was affectionate, never really hugged Bob. And Bob, as a result, also became a dismissive avoidant. And he really went through life keeping everybody at an arm's length. Now, he had been married to his partner, to his wife, for, I want to say it was like 40 years. It was a really long time. They had met at a fairly young age, got married quite quickly, had 2 children, and essentially, he came to me in his first few sessions to start assessing his behavior. He was like, I just want to see how I'm showing up. So we spent the first couple of sessions just going through what I call discovery. We go through, understanding his patterns, all these different dynamics, and how they're playing a role in his life, and also where they come from and what he can do about them. So in the discovery sessions, and this is back when I was running my client practice, he noticed so many different things. And I think that this story just really illustrates what a relationship looks like with with a dismissive avoidant if they're not doing the work. So he said, growing up, a few things that he noticed as he went through life with his wife. He said, first and foremost, he always had this sense of feeling very shut down when receiving feedback, which we all know is very much the I am defective core wound that comes from childhood emotional neglect. So he said that when he went through and his wife would give him feedback, and he was in his early 60s and he had no idea. This was all news to him. He was really willing to look this much later on into his relationship. And he said, I'm realizing now that every time I got feedback from my wife, every time she would say, hey, I need you to do more of this or more of that, he said, I realized basically every time I was consistently defensive. And I remember him sitting there one day and he said, it's almost like she probably felt like I was never truly listening, because the moment she would go there, I would just get defensive and shut down. And sometimes I would reflect on what she said and later try to do some of it, but it was always half-hearted because he was pulled between taking it as criticism and feeling shut down about it and also wanting to sort of be there and support his wife, but often thinking, well, that's your issue. It's your responsibility. He also said basically exactly that. He said so many times he went through and had conversations with his wife when his wife was leaning on him or was going through a hard time. And he said he would be there initially, but he would get impatient quite quickly because he would keep returning to this space of thinking, oh, okay, I'll be here for you, but okay, that's enough now. This is yours. This is yours to deal with. And we know that in healthy relationships, 2 of the first cornerstones of communication are we have to be able to be present when somebody's giving feedback and be willing and open enough to consider it. And then we also want to make sure that we're able to be there in an interdependent relationship to support each other. There is a certain degree of truth to somebody being able to deal with their side of the road, right? And that being a real thing. But they shouldn't be mutually exclusive. It shouldn't be one or the other. There shouldn't be, that's just yours, you deal with it now, or I'm going to take care of it all for you. There should be, hey, you can lean on me and I'm going to be here. And I'm going to trust that you can also move through this yourself, right? We ideally want both of those things. So some of the initial feedback that he noticed as we were going through some of his patterns, that he really struggled the entire marriage to be present, and to really listen and take things in without getting defensive. And he also really noticed that he was constantly in this state of feeling like, hey, that's not really mine. That's not really my problem. And the third big thing that stood out to me is, and you have to remember, like, dismissive avoidance, if you don't get modeling for something, I heard this term once, and it's like, it's an unknown unknown. You don't even know that you don't know something, right? It's not like, oh, there's a fact that exists and I know I just don't have the fact yet. It's like, you don't even know that there's a fact that exists, right? So, and this is so true for so many dismissive avoidants. So he was in particular in a place where he was going, I didn't even know how important it was to be present. I didn't even know, what it meant to be present really, and why that would be meaningful. And so he said one of his biggest regrets is he started to learn, and we had to do a lot of like self-forgiveness work and things around this, but he said one of his biggest regrets was that he wasn't present enough as a father at times and wasn't present enough as a spouse at times. And I think it really impacted him that he wished he had done that at an earlier time. And as he started to realize the impact of it, he made an effort to do that going forward with both of his kids, right? And it actually benefited the relationships a lot, even though his kids were quite a bit older at that point. It was still meaningful, right? It's still meaningful to be able to do that. So that's number 3, like not really being able to showcase that presence. Okay. Number 4, and this was a big one. This is another huge one. He said that he realized, as we were sort of talking about different parts of the work, that he never really thought that he had needs from anybody else. So what that meant, okay, and this is again, like what this looks like long term, what that meant is that because Bob didn't know that he had needs in a relationship, he constantly felt like he was supposed to meet certain needs for others. And he would regulate that by trying to not overextend himself because he didn't realize that he could receive reciprocally. Okay. So I'll give you an example. He said that, a lot of times his wife would ask him to do things, right? Hey, can you be more affectionate? Can you be more validating, more encouraging? And he said he would try to do some of these things, in bits and pieces here and there and make sort of an effort. But he said that he always felt like, well, I don't need anything from you. So why do you need things from me? And he said that there was this constant background space of him not wanting to overextend his emotional energy and fear that he would basically burn out. And this is a reality for both dismissive avoidance and even fearful avoidance in relationships, although they have a slightly different bandwidth, a fearful avoidant from a dismissive avoidant. But essentially, a lot of dismissive avoidance, they don't realize they have needs from other people. And they do. They want to be appreciated and acknowledged. They appreciate receiving support, empathy, understanding. They really value being accepted and having a place that they can open up slowly over time and not be judged. They, very much obviously need freedom, autonomy, independence. They have relationship needs, but they are not consciously aware of them at all. They're just essentially things that people will do for them every so often, and they'll feel good about it and feel connected, but they don't realize that because this person does this for me and I feel good about it and I receive it well and I yearn for more of it means that it's a need in a relationship. Instead, they just think, oh, this person makes me feel good sometimes and I like being around them, right? It's a very sort of simplistic way of thinking about it if you just haven't really had much exposure to other tools. And so he said that he would be in a position where he would think that he didn't really have needs from somebody else. And so he was constantly moderating the energy he gave to others because he was scared that he was going to overextend himself and then feel exhausted. And he would constantly find himself retracting from people, which is, again, another common theme of dismissive avoidant. And so you start to see this picture, right, of somebody who they're caring. He was a caring man. He was a kind man. But you can see these roadblocks that start to showcase themselves in the relationship so far, right? You see that has a hard time receiving criticism and kind of gets defensive about feedback, constantly finding himself needing to kind of pull back and keep space, scared of communicating his needs, difficulty being present, and that sort of being a regretful experience, constantly moderating his energy and his output. A lot of these things you start to see. And so you start to see this picture, and we still have a couple more to cover, but you start to see this picture of somebody who is there, but they're not fully there, right? They're not fully all in because they don't have that capacity or bandwidth to be. And this brings me to that next point, which sort of leapfrogs off of our last one. Point number 5 here is that his emotional bandwidth was constantly diminished. One thing that he really realized as we started doing the work together, this wasn't in the early discovery part, but one thing he came to me and said is he was like, I realized that I actually feel good and have more room and space to be around people when I'm not in this place of constantly protecting my energy. And instead, when I'm in a place of being able to speak up about what I need or share things or feel like I can be more like myself. Okay. And we're going to come into that in just a second because that's a really big one. But he found that he was constantly withholding himself. And as he started to let his guard down and be more vulnerable, that's when he started to feel a little bit more comfortable with people and didn't need to retreat so much. And so again, you see this picture of this person who long term, they're not fully immersed, right? They're not fully in relationships or have that capacity to be fully present in the way that they would want. And before I get into these last two, I just want to let you know that we actually have a really cool promotion happening at PDS for the month of April. And it is a spin to win. So you can actually go to our PDS website and there's like a free trial. There's free membership. There is, all these sort of spin to win things. And I'll put a link down below and you can actually click on the wheel yourself, see what you spin and see what cool promotion you actually end up obtaining. And this is just available for a limited time. Some of it's a 7-day trial plus a free course, 14-day free trial plus a free course. There's some cool stuff in there. Some of which have a really good long-term value. So I'll put the link down below if you want to check it out. And specifically, I would dive into if you're looking to heal, a relationship with somebody on this topic. There's a great course you can check out called How to Repair Any Relationship. And it's about how to vet if somebody's going to do the work and then how to repair it if they're all in with you. Okay, the next major piece here is that a lot of times he realized how much he was hard on himself. And so he would put these huge boundaries around people because he was scared of being seen. And he realized that like when he started to be more accepting of himself, he was finally able to let his guard down and be more of himself with people. So there was this constant, not just withholding of his energy in order to regulate himself, but actually this withholding of like his personality. And he said, people would get different parts of him. His friends would get different sort of parts of him, the sort of humorous, funny version that like to have a good, intellectual debate. And then he said his spouse would get certain parts of him, that attempt to put in that effort, that role of being a father and trying to be consistent and steady. And that was a big way that he gave love. But, at the expense of that consistency and steadiness, was this fear of like looking outside of the box and checking in and gaining insight and being able to be more present or more invested. And so again, these were really big learnings. And for him in this one in particular, he realized that he wasn't sharing all of himself with everybody and that he could be more funny around his wife and have an intellectual debate sometimes. He could be more vulnerable and share his concerns and his needs. Like this was a big part of his healing and his process that allowed him to really flower a lot more as a person. And it came first with a lot of these insights. So again, hopefully you're starting to see this picture. And the last thing here that I think is really important is, and they kind of go hand in hand, is he really struggled to communicate. And so that would leave him setting these huge boundaries. He spent a lot of time communicating more with actions and assuming that other people should be able to fill in the blanks and not realizing how often that was falling on deaf ears. So for example, he had a bit of a trigger around his wife interrupting him. And, his wife actually met at a couple points. She came into sessions a little bit later on in his journey. And she was just outspoken and chatty and, had a bubbly personality. And I don't think she meant anything at all by interrupting him. But sometimes she would accidentally jump in because she wanted to share something. And it came up in the conversation at one point. And she said, my family always did this. We just kind of jump in and chat and talk over each other. And that was normal. And so when he takes it to heart, like I sometimes don't even realize that it could be an offensive thing. And so I miss it. And she said she had tried to work on it and had made a big effort, but every so often it would still happen. And what he realized is that he would have a hard time saying to her, hey, when you do that, I feel like there's not space for me. Hey, when you do that, I feel so unheard. Or if she did interrupt, to say, hold on a second, honey, I was just finishing a point here. Let me finish what I was saying. And because he didn't know how to just articulate those things and set boundaries around those things, which are these last two that go hand in hand, he ended up in a situation too often where he um, would just feel, hurt or small or frustrated. And then he would communicate with his actions by withdrawing or walking away or going into the other room and closing the door. And a lot of times his wife wouldn't even know like what had upset him. And so again, him learning to actually communicate with words, saying, "Oh, wait, you just interrupted, let me finish," being able to take up space. And she worked on interrupting as well, but a lot of the times he was accidentally sort of expecting her to mind read because he wasn't communicating clearly and directly. And that was such an important thing for him in his own healing journey. So, I talk a little bit about what the healing was for him, but, that's the picture. You get this picture of somebody who, if they're not healed and not doing the work, may be defensive to feedback, maybe in a position where they are very sensitive to criticism and shut down very easily, may have a hard time being present in the relationship a lot of the time, may be constantly regulating their emotional bandwidth and their energy, may not know that they have needs from somebody else. And so have a difficult time conveying those things and constantly need to retreat to kind of soothe themselves and meet their own needs. And then also struggle to really articulate what is going on from a communication point of view, from a point of view around their behaviors. The one thing I'll say too, and I'll just add in here, is a lot of dismissive avoidants have a dynamic of numbing, right? Like we say that dismissive avoidants are good self-soothers, but a lot of times they're self-numbing, right? They're escaping themselves, they're avoiding, they're not targeting challenges head on and going head first into them to be like, what's triggering me? What's upsetting me? What can I do about it? What need do I have to feel better? No, they end up, for him, he spent a lot of time going to his man cave and tinkering with things and building things. And that's not a terrible activity. That was actually healthier than most dismissive avoidance I saw. But for him, a lot of the tinkering and building stuff was also, with 4 or 5 beers every night and going down there and drinking and doing things. And again, like this isn't me judging people's lifestyle or habits, but I do think there's something to be said for like, did you solve for those problems, or are we constantly going through this state of trying to regulate through avoidance, and how that can also impact a marriage and a relationship long term? So, most importantly, okay, there are signs to look out for that somebody is healing. I'm going to be putting out a video about that later this week. So make sure you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss it. But I'm going to be putting out a video about that. So the signs to actually look for as somebody's healing, the things to vet for to see if somebody's doing the work. Because the last thing you want is if you're in a situation, and I think it's so useful to know somebody's attachment style, but somebody's attachment style is not fixed for the rest of their life if they put the work in. And you need to know the difference between, am I investing in a relationship with somebody who's willing to do the work? Because if they are and they're in it right now, that's amazing. But if they're not and they refuse and they never want to look at any of their own patterns or themes, that will cause a certain degree of stress to the relationship long term. And that will increase the likelihood that things don't work out. So making sure that you are vetting, that you are clear on the signs that somebody is healing, that whether or not somebody is going to do the work or is currently doing the work, are huge things to pay attention to, because it will determine the quality of your relationships long term. So that's it for today. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that video. Thank you so much for stopping by and for watching.